we'll first hear from Professor Mitsuho Ikeda, then we'll hear from RMIT's Emeritus Professor Michael Barrett, who is a renowned scholar of urban studies, housing and public policy, and is located in RMIT's Centre for Urban Research. Mike's been at RMIT for a very long time, focusing on urban development processes, urban social theory, economics and public policy, as well as housing markets and policy. And he's played significant national roles, such as being the director of Ahuri for a period of time as well. So I will now hand over to Professor Mitsuho Ikeda for 5 minutes, and then we'll have some further remarks from Mike Berry. And I do have a little bell. Here we go. So at 5 minutes, we'll sound that bell and move on to the next speaker.
Thank you for Professor Dodson for chairing this event. I'm Professor Mitsuho Ikeda, Director of Center for the Study of Cool Design at Osaka University. It is a real pleasure to be able to join this virtual book launch today. In particular, I'm delighted to have opportunity to co-host this event with RMIT Center for Urban Research led by Professor Dodson. Over the past 3 years, since Brendan joined our center, we have collaborated with Royal Melbourne in a number of ways, and Professor Larissa Hughes is visiting professor at our center. The Center for Study of Design, CSCD, was established in July 2016, and although our goal is mainly to develop improved educational programs, we are required to address the many challenges facing our world today. As such, we do a lot of work at community level. You may know that Japanese local community, particularly those outside of big cities, are confronted with falling birth rate, aging populations, depopulations through out-migration and economic decline. In response, we need to find a new way to relativize these communities, and sometimes this may come down to ethical conversations about what is right course of action. I'm cultural anthropologist and ethnographer with a specific focus on political economy of health and indigenous social movement. I have worked extensively in research field in various areas of Central America. As you can imagine, both ethical and respectful approaches are critically important. Indeed, I have organized educational workshop on research ethics for students and faculty at Osaka University. Ethics is becoming an increasingly visible component in research activities. For example, last year, we established a new research center on ethical issues. The primary concern of this new center is how to effectively evaluate the ethical, legal, and social implications of new and emerging technologies. These kind of assessment will become increasingly important, especially in the area of biotechnology and information sciences. Anyway, after reading the book entitled Ethical Cities, I also appreciated that we need to go after a broader ethical framework for our communities, ethics, cities, and society as a whole. Interestingly, the author don't talk about some kind of utopian endpoint for cities, but rather implies that we should think in terms of an ethical trajectory or orientation. I'm very impressed with the author's both moral and practical idealistics. There is an unavoidable degree of cultural relativism that will influence the formation of ethical cities. Generally speaking, each local ethics has dynamic entities that never stay in same locus in world geopolitical time and space. I appreciated that the goal is not pursuit of a perfect ethical city, but employing ethical perspectives is very important in influencing how we see the world and our places in it. We now confirm that our authors avoid being too prescriptive, but rather share with us example of what cities are already doing. As I have already said, I'm not an urban expert, and as such, I look forward hearing the views of participants and their ideas on the relevance of potential an idea like the ethical city. Thank you, and I look forward your contributions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ikeda, for your opening remarks. Very interesting and insightful. I now call on Professor Mike Berry to offer his thoughts.
Ethical Cities is an important book, but it's also a very timely book. The first 2 decades of the 21st century has been defined by A, remorselessly rising social inequality and exclusion, and B, a rolling series of social and environmental crises punctuated by the GFC and the Great Pandemic. However, the glaring problems created by both these dramatic events should not be allowed to hide the equally critical realisation that all this surface chaos has overlaid and partly hidden the deep embedded structures of inequality, insecurity and injustice that gained a solid grip during the last 3 decades of the 20th century, by which I mean the economic victory of shareholder capitalism and the political triumph of neoliberal ideology and policy. These deep currents of incivility have been driven by and focused on the ways in which cities and metropolitan regions and their networked interrelationships have systematically undercut older communitarian relations of reciprocity and mutual support. Such traditional functions of cities throughout history provided safe places for urban dwellers, albeit often in situations of extreme inequalities of power and privilege. But historically, the harsh yoke of social control was often softened in most cases by the self-imposed limits to the expression of power and the assertions of privilege by the urban elites and by the native resilience of subject peoples, self-organising structures of cooperation. The general sense of common membership of the city took root and anchored a widespread sense of basic security, at least for those residents deemed citizens. For those excluded, like slaves, women and foreigners in democratic ancient Athens, urban life still had a sense of order and security, if not rampant opportunity. But the neoliberal city that developed throughout the global capitalist city in both East and West over the past 50 years has shredded much of the historic inheritance of urban civility by tearing asunder the bonds of mutual recognition and support, while shattering the traditions of inclusion. Rampant individualism has driven social relations of communal interaction out of the temple. Neoliberal ethics have shrunk to a singularity, the pursuit of individual advantage, an anything-goes approach to life, nature, and the universe. At the individual level, similar arguments of the sophist might is right. At the level of society and more broadly the planet, such a trajectory is leading to environmental catastrophe, unless this is either preempted by some other global intervention by one or more horsemen of the apocalypse, like another pandemic or war, or more hopefully the transcendence of the neoliberal city by the ethical city, assuming we have time and the collective wit to achieve the latter. We're focusing on cities because the buck stops there. For the first time, really, since the civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, a very considerable proportion of the world's population live an urban existence. And most of the key decisions that affect everybody alive today and future, wherever they live, are being influenced by what goes on in cities today. Hence the importance of this book and the ideas raised here and for discussion here. One key thought worth dwelling on is the author's insistence that ethical cities are environments in which individual rights and collective responsibilities are balanced. This is easily stated as a principle, but very difficult to tie down in specific instances, or in the form suitable to inform concrete policies. The best ways of operationalising this dictum, I suggest, would be to focus on the most extreme cases of imbalance, situations, institutions, rules and structures that reinforce the rights of powerful individuals over the imperatives of collective responsibilities. The example I'd give here is the privileging of the unconstrained exploitation of minerals for shareholder profit over the preservation of traditional rights of Indigenous peoples to cultural artefacts and country. This clearly transgresses against the ideals of the ethical city. It should be remembered that the decision to mine in culturally sensitive and environmentally risky terrains are made by a few people, mostly men, located in a few global cities. I'd like to say one thing about the final chapter of Ethical Cities, because I think it's a very important one. It focuses on what social scientists call the transition problem, how to get from A to B, from inequality and insecurity to the opposite, to the ethical city, when there's a huge chasm between both. So what's really needed is a stage strategy. First, I'd suggest work iteratively on those most egregious and/or strategic cases of urban failure. Then wait for the right time to aim higher, usually when a crisis hits. For example, in Australia at the moment, there's a huge furore over invisible sexual abuse of women in the federal parliament and society at large. This offers a pressure point for successful action. The bigger the crisis, the bigger the opportunity for progressive change. Then wait for the backlash as the forces of the powerful regroup. There's a need to maintain the rage and build and rebuild organisations of opposition. All this requires resources and leadership, obviously. Marx once famously said, philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. The final chapter of Ethical Cities gives an impressive range of examples of what progressive transformations might look like. But the point is how to get there. My last comment relates to the author's support for democracy. I think this is a difficult issue to grasp because I don't think we should be opposing different forms of democracy. I think it's not a question of opposing forms of democracy, but blending ways of engaging and informing citizens within wider structures of representation and accountability that reinforce the culture of inclusion and sustainability, defining the goal of ethical urbanism. By coincidence, I have a book coming out this July called Democracy and Justice, a Regressive Agenda for the 21st Century. And with that shameless plug, it's back to you, Chair.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, for your insightful comments and for, I guess, placing the book within the contemporary global and even national and local scales through that interpretation. So thank you, Mike.